New York City, Harlem. During the early portion of the 20th century, Harlem was the destination for migrants from around the country, attracting both people from the South seeking work and an educated class who made the area a center of culture, as well as a growing Negro middle class. These people were looking for a fresh start in life, and this was a good place to go. By the 1970s, many of those Harlemites who were able to escape from poverty left the neighborhood in search of better schools and homes and safer streets. Those who remained were the poorest and least skilled, with the fewest opportunities for success. Even with that, Harlem remained the cultural and political capital of Black New York and possibly Black America. In the early 1980s, New York experienced a large upsurge in heroin activity. Certain dealers dominated the heroin trade, such as Frank Lucas, Bumpy Johnson, Nicky Barnes, just to name a few. But the AIDS epidemic sort of neutralized the demand for heroin. Crack began to dominate the drug scene, giving users something to turn to. Cocaine was a social drug, but when crack came, it was cheaper, and people in the urban community sold their soul for it. At first, dealers were released if they were caught by police, because they didn't know what it was. Older guys from the heroin trade schooled younger guys who would eventually take over the game. By the mid to late 80s, crack was in high demand, your gang was your block, they were crews. This was going on throughout New York City, but most players would come to Harlem to show off their cars, jewelry, and mingle. It was rooftop, there was Willie Burgers, there was Apollo Theater, it was a culture. There were many well-known crews, but today's story is about one in particular, the lynch mob. The gang's rise is the story of how a handful of criminals held an entire neighborhood hostage, piling up bodies and mocking justice. Its fall reflects a growing effort by authorities to use federal racketeering laws designed to fight the mafia against street gangs. For more than 5 years, this drug gang conducted what prosecutors called a reign of terror in central Harlem, murdering rival gangsters, shooting bystanders, and terrorizing the neighborhood surrounding Lenox Avenue and 142 D Street. Gang members even entered Harlem Hospital Center and Hospital Whites in an unsuccessful effort to stab a rival drug dealer whom they had failed to kill a few days earlier, despite shooting him 15 times. The lynch mob. 10 defendants were charged with 15 murders and 9 attempted murders, 5 of them bystanders who were seriously wounded by indiscriminate gang gunfire. They were also charged with armed robberies and distributing hundreds of pounds of cocaine and crack in Harlem. Often, it was packaged in plastic baby powder containers. They would find themselves opening a wholesale drug distribution network down the East Coast. Once the lynch mob had reached maturity, it had wiped out many of its rivals on the streets of Harlem and was branching out, getting money in Alabama and Louisiana. One of the murders would take place in Alabama. The lynch mob made millions of dollars annually, running the drug business. From 1988 through 1994, the Charles Leon Brown, aka Fat Leon, was the leader of the 142nd Street lynch mob crew. Lewis, who was also known as Homicide Lou or Lou Sims, was Leon's top lieutenant. He provided protection and security to the crew's narcotics trafficking operation. He did so by enlisting the assistance of several other members and associates of the crew, and by organizing and supervising the crew's violent acts. Indeed, during the relevant time period, Lou Sims committed and conspired to commit several murders as part of his role as the organizer of the crew's violent acts. He was known to drive a white MPV, which was a go-to vehicle, specifically a van, that a lot of drug dealers had in the 90s. Lou Sims, Wallace, aka Black, and Chris ran a day-to-day operation selling green top crack in various locations. Chris's brother, Dwayne, managed spots in the area and sold red top crack. Ferris was another key member who at several times engaged in acts of violence to protect and promote the crew. Hobby Johnson, as a gang member, helped the gang maintain control over the Harlem neighborhood in which it sold drugs, committing acts of violence against rival drug dealers. During his time as a gang member, Hobby Johnson committed, or conspired to commit, 5 murders. One of the earliest murders happened on or about September 12, 1989. Lou Sims conspired to murder, and did murder, an individual named Darnell Wells. Fat Leon provided Lou with a gun to commit the murder. Thereafter, Lou Sims took Wells' bike to lure Wells to a specific area, and then shot him multiple times. In November 1988, Hobby Johnson conspired to kill Ronald Hill. Ronald Hill, also known as Monty, was committing robberies in the hood. No one was off limits. He was robbing stores, dealers, and people walking the street. He was seen as reckless. Allegedly, Ron Wallace and Fat Leon paid Hobby $1,000 to put down Monty. Monty was killed on 138th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue. In November 1989, Hobby Johnson and Wallace shot to death Donald Moore, aka Duck. Duck was basically on the same type of time as Monty. Wallace and Hobby went to 141st Street between 7th and 8th where they found Duck. Hobby shot him and killed him with a .45. Allegedly, Duck had robbed one of the managers at one of the gang's crack distribution locations. In March of 1990, Wallace and a worker, Wiggins, was caught in a retaliatory shooting for the Duck murder. Wiggins had about 500 vials of crack on him and was killed in the shooting. Wallace was seriously injured. The next murder took place on or about January 18, 1991, when Lou Sims aided and abetted the murder of an individual named Woodrow, aka Sunday. Sunday, who got his drugs from the lynch mob, was running a drug spot out of an apartment building on 140th Street. He shared the building with a PCP dealer named Mike. Because of a disagreement between the lynch mob and Sunday, Sunday was killed. It was said that Sunday had robbed a spot of the lynch mobs. Mike began paying protection money to Lou. At the same time, he was paying protection money to members of another crew, the 139th Street crew. On or about July 24, 1991, Lou aided and abetted the murder of an individual named Robert Travis Reeves. Allegedly, Reeves was a known murderer and had in fact murdered some of lynch mob's associates. Earlier that month, Hobby Johnson went to Morningside Park intending to kill Reeves, a rival drug dealer who presented a threat to the gang's drug trafficking operations. Inside the park, Hobby Johnson located an individual who matched the description of Reeves. He shot to death that individual, who turned out to be a man named Raymond Uzzell, not Reeves. Lou Sims and one of his co-conspirators found Reeves sitting in a dune buggy in Manhattan approximately 1 week later and shot him several times. Alan Glenn was another drug dealer in Harlem. He was getting money, but the lynch mob had plans to expand their territory. On or about October 1, 1991, Lou Sims killed Albert Glenn. The murder came after Glenn told Lou that he could not sell drugs in the area. Lou became enraged and sent for a weapon, and then shot Glenn when the weapon arrived, killing him. Johnny Sprague Jr. had lived in Birmingham most of his life. Sprague and Bimbo sold drugs. He and Bimbo received their drug supply from Carlton K. Henry, who, in turn, purchased the drugs from the 142nd Street lynch mob crew. During September 1992, while he and Bimbo were outside in the Avondale projects, a policeman drove up and asked Bimbo to walk over to his car. Because Bimbo was in possession of drugs, he ran from the officer. During the pursuit, Bimbo threw the drugs on the roof of a shed. A short time later, Sprague met Bimbo at Bimbo's grandmother's house. Bimbo was talking on the phone with Henry. Bimbo told Henry about being chased by a police officer, throwing the drugs on the shed's roof, and learning that another dude, Christopher Davis, had retrieved the drugs and refused to return them. After Bimbo ended his telephone conversation with Henry, he told Sprague that Davis had taken possession of some of the drugs and was refusing to return them. Bimbo told Sprague that Henry indicated he was going to have his man and them to come down here and take care of the situation. Approximately 1 week after Davis refused to return the drugs, Henry came to his apartment with Lou homicide. Later that night at a motel near the Birmingham airport, Sprague met Lou, Henry, and Johnny O. Sprague, Lou, Henry, and Johnny O. rode around in the Avondale area that night and Henry pointed Davis out in a group of people at a playground. Lou wanted to kill Davis at that time, but that Henry told him to wait until later. The next day, Sprague, Lou Sims, Henry, Johnny O, and Bimbo met at a church in Avondale. Bimbo gave Henry $4,000. Henry then gave Lou and Johnny O each $2,000. This was payment for the hit. The next day Lou Sims called Sprague and asked him to help find Davis. Sprague went to the motel and picked up Lou Sims and Johnny O, who were dressed in black clothing and had two 6-shot .357 Magnum revolvers. That same night, Sprague drove Lou Sims and Johnny O around the Avondale area in search of Davis. They stopped outside the Avondale pool game room and that he found Davis inside the game room. Sprague returned to the vehicle where Lou Sims and Johnny O were waiting, got into the driver's side, and told them where Davis was standing and what Davis was wearing. According to Sprague, he stayed in the vehicle while Lou Sims and Johnny O entered the game room. Sprague heard several gunshots come from the game room. Lou Sims and Johnny O then ran out of the game room and got into the vehicle. As Sprague drove away, someone fired 2 shots at them, and that his vehicle was hit by buckshot. Sprague drove Lou Sims and Johnny O to the motel. At the motel, Sprague put Lou Sims and Johnny O's guns in the trunk of his vehicle, along with the empty shell casings. Henry drove Lou Sims and Johnny O to the Hartsfield International Airport in Atlanta, so that there would not be a record of their leaving Alabama. Later that day, Sprague and Bimbo threw the guns and the shell casings into East Lake. When he returned to the game room and looked through a window, Davis's body was lying in the same area where Davis was standing before the shooting occurred. Christopher Davis would leave behind his son, Christopher Davis Jr. Davis Jr. would go on to make one of the biggest plays in football history when he ran for 109 yards off a failed field goal in the Iron Bowl. In 1992, Fat Leon accepted a contract to kill Conrad Layton in exchange for $7,500. He gave the contract to a lynch mob member, Anthony Pope, who shot Layton with a silenced pistol. Layton survived. Heading toward the end of '92, in November, lynch mob member Clifford, aka Hot Dog, shot and killed a dealer named Muskrat for selling fake crack in a spot. A month later, on or about December 12, 1992, Lou Sims conspired to murder and participated in the murder of an individual named Benoit Cheeks after Cheeks slapped the mother of one of his associates. Lou provided the murder weapon, a .357 Magnum, to the individual that shot and killed Cheeks. In June 1993, Fat Leon and one of his lieutenants, Lou Sims, ordered 2 other members of the lynch mob to murder another member, Carlton Henry. He was the one supplying Bimbo and Sprague in Alabama. In order to clear the way for Fat Leon to control the lynch mob, Carlton Henry, who was becoming a threat, had to go. He was murdered by lynch mob associates on June 28, 1993. Ferris pled guilty to the murder. In October 1993, Ferris conspired to kill members of a rival narcotics organization in response to a turf battle. 2 members of the rival narcotics organization died as a result. In 1993, Fat Leon accepted a contract from one of his cocaine suppliers to kill 2 members of a downtown rival drug organization, known as the Young Guns. The Young Guns operated on 134th Street. Allegedly, the Young Guns were having an internal dispute and wanted 2 of its own crew members murdered. After accepting the contract, Leon directed lynch mob members to murder Tyrone Lineberger and Stephen Bozeman in exchange for $10,000 for each murder. Lineberger and Bozeman were murdered by Lou Sims and another lynch mob member on November 15, 1993. On or about January 12, 1994, Lou Sims and Ferris murdered an individual named Jansen B. Smalls, aka Jay Black, who had previously threatened Ferris's life. Lou set up an escape route for Ferris to run after shooting and killing Smalls. During the incident that led to Smalls' murder, an innocent bystander was also injured and was paralyzed as a result. On or about March 11, 1994, Leon and Lou ordered Ferris and another member Hot Dog to murder Harold Brown, aka Breeze. The hit was over a dispute regarding narcotics payments. Breeze had threatened to kill Leon. In turn, Ferris shot Brown 15 times. Astonishingly, the hit was unsuccessful, as the crew would learn that Brown did not die on the scene. While Brown was recuperating in the hospital from multiple gunshot wounds, allegedly, John Hobby, Lou Sims and Ferris, disguised as medical personnel, and managed to smuggle a knife into Harlem Hospital in an unsuccessful attempt to complete the murder. In July 1994, a man was shot to death on a Harlem street, and 4 bystanders were wounded by gunfire. Lynch mob members, Derek, aka Boutney, were responsible for what the police called a revenge killing of a drug dealer. The dead man, Hemsley Bethia, aka 50, was shot shortly after 6 p.m. while being chased on foot by 4 men on 134th Street east of Frederick Douglass Boulevard. The men fired 16 or 17 shots, and 50, of 215 West 131st Street, was pronounced dead at the scene. Shortly after this, Boutney would get shot and survived. 1 slug hit a woman in the chest, and 3 others hit men, but none was seriously injured. On or about August 29, 1994, students at Columbia University were moving belongings into their residences prior to the start of classes. They were witnesses to this next act of violence. An attempt on the life of a man named Sekou Shusta, aka Shaq, took place. One story is, he was believed to have attempted to have a relationship with Lou Sims' baby moms. The other story is that it was because Shusta was responsible for the Bootney shooting. In an attempt to murder Shusta, Lou drove with Van McDuffie to Manhattan, 112th and Broadway, where Vincent shot Shusta and left a massive gunshot wound in Shusta's chest. He was arrested fleeing the scene. This was just a shell of what actually happened on 142nd Street. By the end of 1994, some, if not all members of the lynch mob were arrested for their crimes. The lynch mob trafficking enterprise used violence to enforce its will and terrorize a community. There were other murders, attempted murders, robberies, and other things not mentioned here in this story. Although some innocent bystanders were victims, in this time, most killers got close to their advisories and committed the murder. Today's killers are shooting from far, and innocent people are paying the price for personal disputes. Ferris and Lou never told. They have paid their debts to community. Some of the other members testified against others for leniency. Again, this was just an outline, a lookout for those guys to tell their story. This was the lynch mob story. As always, stay low, and thanks for watching.